On this edition of the CBS Video Library of World War II, we'll look at the war in the Pacific, how we got into it, and how in those early days we and our allies were often bloodied. In recalling those days, we'll share a visit with a man who helped make the attack on Pearl Harbor happen. He was a spy for Japan. We'll be in Singapore as what was thought to be the impossible, the unthinkable, actually happens. The Japanese launch an attack on the British island fortress of Singapore. In the Philippines, we'll witness an American defeat before the war tides turn and General MacArthur in victory return to those islands. And we'll fly the mission of General Jimmy Doolittle on the first bombing raid of the war against the Japanese homeland. December 7th, 1941. The pictures tell the story. Most of the Pacific Fleet is in ruins in the waters of Pearl Harbor. America's military might has been dealt a severe blow. How could this surprise Japanese attack have happened? Well, we found part of the answer in a story we worked on back in 1961. This was our portrait of the man who spied on Pearl Harbor.
This is Walter Cronkite reporting from Pearl Harbor. This is the story of a spy. 20 years ago, on December 7th, 1941, in this famous harbor, the Japanese struck in a devastating surprise attack that for the United States began World War II. The events leading up to that attack provide an incredible story of Japanese espionage. This man spied on Pearl Harbor. His name is Takeo Yoshikawa. Today, we have brought him back to Pearl Harbor to tell his story.
In 1941, from March until the bomb fell in December, I was on the staff of Japanese consulate in Honolulu. I was not a diplomat. I was a Navy officer, and I was a spy sent by the Japanese Imperial Navy. During those few months, in a way, I held history in the palm of my hand.
Our story begins with an arrival in Honolulu and the return of a spy. Aboard this jet from Tokyo is a man who has not seen this island for 20 years. His last view came a few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an attack he helped make possible. Then he was sailing off to an internment camp in the United States and a quick repatriation to Japan, a prisoner of the American government, in custody as an enemy diplomat, not as a spy. He spent the war years in Tokyo in naval intelligence. He is a slight, plain man, pleasant enough, although occasionally quick-tempered, a devout Zen Buddhist, married, father of two. His present business is running a gas station in Japan. He returns to Pearl Harbor to relive his moment in history. We took Yoshikawa back to a vastly different Pearl Harbor. Today's mobile fleet, constantly on the prowl, comes here only infrequently now. We approached the Arizona Memorial, where more than 1,100 men lie buried with the sunken battleship. We put the camera on him and said nothing. Later we asked, do you feel sad, ashamed of being a spy? Ashamed? No, he said. I was a Navy officer under orders. I could not disobey. Sad, yes. Sad for all those who died here in the war, American and Japanese. We thought as Yoshikawa walked through the great base how swiftly history moves in the 20th century. For there, nested among the American ships, were 4 destroyers flying another flag, one that seemed bizarre and out of place here, the Rising Sun. 4 destroyers of the Japanese Navy on a training cruise to Pearl Harbor. The world has moved, but there are still scars at Pearl Harbor. Hickam Field, the bullet-riddled headquarters building. Of December 7th, naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison has written, "Never in modern history was a war begun with so smashing a victory. Never in recorded history did the initial victor pays so dearly for his calculated treachery. On Aiea Heights, whose commanding views he knew so well, over which his country's plains swooped that quiet Sunday morning, a man relives his past.
I am Takeo Yoshikawa. I was the man who spied on Pearl Harbor. Now I can tell my story. In those days, my English was very good. It had to be. Today, it is not so good. Since this is a difficult story, I'll tell it in Japanese.
I am 50 years old. I was born March 7, 1912, on Shikoku Island, the city of Matsuyama, southeast of Tokyo. I live there today. My father was a policeman. I was frail and weak as a young boy, but my father made me live a Spartan life. And by the time I was 11, I was strong and healthy. I could run well, I could swim 2 miles, and I was at the top in school. My ambition was to go to the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, and in 1929, I was admitted as a naval cadet. The Naval Academy was a hard, severe place. They emphasized the Bushido, the way of the warrior, the absolute loyalty of the warrior, the samurai. We were almost entirely isolated from the world. For 3 years and 8 months, we were there studying the military sciences. The physical training was very hard. There was swimming, at which I was very good, and there was the kendo, the Japanese stick fencing. I practiced this very hard. We young officers, the minds of young officers like me, were inclined towards the right-wing way of thinking. We were taught we should be ready to die at any moment. In spite of all the teaching, I always had a fear of death. I worked very hard at the academy. I was not cum laude in my studies, but I was able to get them done. My motto is study and concentrate. In 1933, I graduated. By now, I had decided that I could work for my country even if I lost my life. I went to sea as an ensign aboard the old battleship Asama and then the light cruiser Ura. That was in 1934. I was a code officer, and that helped me later at Pearl Harbor. We made a Mediterranean cruise, and I got a chance to go to Paris. We also visited Mussolini in Rome. When we got back to Japan, I was accepted for training as a naval aviator. I learned to handle the stick and throttle and to kick the rudder to turn the airplane. I thought this would help my professional advancement in the Navy. Then, one day, coming back from the flight line, I was stricken with severe abdominal pains. I was sent to the hospital, and in July 1935, back to my native city to recuperate. It was a great shock. My Navy career seemed to be finished. However, in 1936, a Navy captain came to see me. My health was much better. He said, "In this time of crisis, why aren't you working with us?" By then, all Japanese naval officers knew that we would someday fight the United States, and that it would be a naval war. The captain said there was a place for me in the Navy General Staff, 3rd Section, Intelligence. There would be no promotions for me. I told the captain I would do it. I was then only 25 years old. Since I had been studying English, I was assigned to the section dealing with the British and American navies. My specialty was the U.S. Pacific Fleet. I became the Japanese Navy's expert on the American Navy. I read everything: diplomatic reports from our naval attachés, secret reports from our agents around the world. I read military commentators like Hanson Baldwin in the New York Times. I read history too, like the works of Mahan, the famous American admiral. I studied Jane's fighting ships. I memorized the silhouettes of all the ships. That was very important to me later at Pearl Harbor. I read all the military journals, like the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. I was interested in American military thinking, strategic thinking. I always say, I am not a bright person, but I work very hard. One day in late 1940, my section chief called me and said, "How would you like to go to Honolulu and check the American Navy with your own eyes?" At first, I couldn't understand. Then he said, "You will have to let your hair grow long." At that time, I wore my hair short, like all military officers. But when you go abroad as a diplomat, you wear long hair. Now I knew. I would go into the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. I would see the American Navy with my own eyes and provide accurate information. He said, say yes or no, and I replied at once, yes, sir, I will go. I left Yokohama on March 20, 1941, aboard the Nita Maru. I never expected to return to Japan alive. I was to pose as a consular clerk in Honolulu, and I had a new name. I was not Takeo Yoshikawa. I was Tadashi Morimura. Since I had a new name, I had to change all my clothes, my shirts and shoes and suits. My name will appear here if I wear an old suit, and I will be discovered. On my luggage, I had to put the letter M. I told no one where I was going, not even my parents. We arrived in 1 week. On March 27, 1941, the Honolulu paper printed the announcement in the shipping news. As soon as I arrived, I went to the consulate, which is located, then as now, on Nuano Avenue. As I walk up to it today, as I walk through my past, I remember very well walking up to it that day in 1941. There is a new building now, otherwise it's the same. I remember walking inside and meeting the Consul General, Mr. Nagao Kita. He was short and fat, very pleasant and gay, although this day he was nervous. He knew all about my mission. I took out $600 from my inner pocket. That was all they gave me in Japan to handle the espionage in Hawaii. I showed the money to Mr. Kita. He told me to be careful. The FBI had been strengthened in Hawaii, and they were watching things very closely. But he would help. He would do what had to be done. From that day on, this was my headquarters. All of my messages would be sent from here in code to Tokyo. This became the center for Japanese espionage in Honolulu. I began my activities immediately. The same day I arrived, I began walking around the island. Since I am a newcomer to Hawaii, everything was new to me. Eventually, I would cover not only Oahu, but all the other islands too, pretending to be a sightseer. In Hawaii, there were more than 150,000 Japanese, 83,000 on Oahu alone, so it was not too conspicuous for me to travel around. The Japanese Americans never gave me any help. They were faithful and loyal to America. If there were any other agent from Japan at the time, I never saw them or knew anything about them. I worked strictly alone. The place I wanted to see most was Pearl Harbor. Every day I took a car or a taxi or a bus ride and passed through those places where I could observe it. I saw a great deal. It wasn't hard for me to see what I wanted to see. A simple thing like renting a plane at John Rogers Airport and taking a sightseeing tour. I did that all the time. And whenever possible, I made sure we flew over or near Pearl Harbor. And everything I saw, everything I heard, everything I deduced, I sent it all to Tokyo. A place I visited frequently was Pearl City, near Pearl Harbor. Every day I would make a point of walking through here to the end of the peninsula, where I could easily study the airstrip on Forward Island and Battleship Row. I remember this very spot. I used to walk out here carrying a fishing pole. It was a fine place to go fishing. And if anybody asked me, I would just tell them that I came for fishing and lost my way. The beaches of Oahu were especially important to me. I swam at practically all of the waterfronts, studying the tides, beach gradients, underwater obstructions, and the like. I became very familiar with these places. Tokyo was very interested in learning about anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets, and I tried to investigate this. It was a dangerous thing to do. A lot of places were off limits, and I couldn't get in. I had to take chances. For almost a week, I covered Waikiki Beach. The sun burned my body totally black, and even the backs of my feet and my hands, arms and legs, became very burned. There were a lot of excellent places to go sightseeing. Aiea Heights, the fine hills beyond Pearl Harbor, and Tantalus Mountain above Honolulu, perfect places to watch the fleet. I observed ships coming in and going out. I knew them by silhouette. How many? Which way are they going? I never knew when I might be caught by the FBI. I hammered everything into my head. I never carried a note, a pencil, or a camera. No small bombs or secret documents the way you read in novels. Intelligence work requires a detailed mind, accuracy, and patience. It is not an adventure. It is hard work. Before very long, I could identify every ship in the harbor by one quick sight. One of the best places for me was a Japanese tea house called Shancho Row. It was in the heights of Alua, below Aiea, and had a good view of Pearl Harbor. It is still there today, only it is now called Natsunoya Tea House. The old Mama-san is still there too. And when I came back, she looked at me and said, "Morimura, Morimura, I thought you were dead. I remember you. You were a big drinker in those days." She thought I was a big drinker and liked to play around with the geishas. Sometimes I did drink a little too much, but most times I pretended to be drunk so I could stay there all night. I watched the lights from the boats, the searchlights from the ships and from the harbor. And from those things, I could guess what was happening out there. And then, early in the morning, I could see how many ships were leaving, what direction they were taking. I watched them sail out through the narrow channel. How long did it take them to leave? How quickly could they leave? Then I would hurry back to the consulate and tell Tokyo. I took some grave risks. Once, disguising myself as an unemployed Filipino, I got a job as a dishwasher at the Navy officers' mess hall. I remember, as I stand here now, that my idea was to enable me to eavesdrop on interesting conversations that I might hear. What I heard indicated to me very little, only that few, if any, American officers expected war. 1941 approached its end. On November 1st, a ship was due in Honolulu from Japan. It was the Taiyo Maru, and the Honolulu paper printed notice of her expected arrival in the shipping news. She came into the harbor and moored without incident. What the paper didn't print was that on board was the youngest lieutenant commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that he was disguised as a ship's purser. His name was Suzuki, and today he is Vice Admiral Suguro Suzuki, the head of the Japanese Navy, or Self-Defense Force, as we call it.
When we arrived in Pearl Harbor, I could see a lot of ships and other interesting things. Consul General Kido came aboard. There was a list of 97 questions that I wanted answered. Kido gave these questions to a Mr. Yoshikawa, who was once an ensign in the Japanese Navy. I knew him quite well.
I began answering each question. They were written so small that I couldn't read them without using a magnifying glass.
On what day of the week would the most ships be in Pearl Harbor on normal occasions?
Sunday.
How many large seaplanes patrol from Pearl at dawn and sunset?
Morning and evening, about 10 both times. I can count them as they pass over the front lawn of the consulate at dawn and dusk.
Are there anti-submarine nets at the entrance of Pearl Harbor?
Maybe so, but I don't know the details.
Are the ships fully provided with supplies and ready for sea?
They are not ready for combat, loaded with normal supplies and provisions only.
Each week the fleet goes to sea. Where do they go? What do they do? Particularly aircraft carriers.
Mostly unknown. Conversations with American sailors provide little information. I can supply arrivals and departures, but destinations are difficult to find out.
We left Honolulu on November 5th, 1941, and arrived in Japan on November the 12th. I gave the information from Yoshikawa to the Imperial Japanese Navy. I boarded a ship which took me to Tankan Bay in the Kurile Island, where the task force destined to attack Pearl Harbor was gathered. I reported information in detail. I briefed all the pilots. I watched the task force leave for Pearl Harbor. There were 33 ships and 423 planes. The date was November 26, 1941.
Meanwhile, in Honolulu, the days moved on to December 5th, 1941. On Tokyo's orders, I began using a radio station to place lost and found messages. The station, of course, could not know what was going on. And I didn't know either that the Japanese task force was on its way, and that the messages were being picked up and decoded on the Akagi, flagship of the fleet, steaming toward Pearl Harbor. I placed this one. Lost German police dog with name Mayor 5, white reward. On the Akagi, this meant carrier left Pearl Harbor on 5th. Another message I placed. Chinese rug, almost new, for sale. This meant new heavy cruiser arriving. House to rent Waikiki meant shore leave as usual. On December 6, 1941, I hurried to a sugarcane field on the heights overlooking Pearl Harbor. I looked down at Pearl Harbor. Down there, I could see a great deal. There were many ships, and I could plot their positions and their distances and their locations in a detailed way. I tried to remember them. I remembered them. For 8 months, I had been sending a stream of coded cables to Tokyo, first once a week, then every 3 days. Now on orders every day. I knew the time was near, but I did not know when the attack would come. I just kept sending my messages. And these were some of the messages I sent. The usual schedule for departure and return of battleships is as follows. Ships leaving on Tuesday, return on Friday. Ships leaving on Friday, return on Saturday of the following week. All ships remain in port for about 1 week. The fleet normally returns to Pearl Harbor as soon as training maneuvers are completed. Battleships are often moored in pairs in Battleship Row. Torpedo attacks against inboard ships ineffectual. I think there is still a good chance for a surprise attack. In my opinion, the battleships do not have torpedo nets. This brings me to December 7th, 1941, 1:20 in the morning, my last message. It went as follows. Vessels moored in harbor, 9 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 seaplane tenders, 17 destroyers. All aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers have departed harbor. No indications of any changes in U.S. fleet or anything unusual. That is all. That's the situation. Now it was very early in the morning of December 7th, but I couldn't sleep. I tried to tune a shortwave radio, but I couldn't get anything. Finally, I went to sleep and slept through until the morning. At 7:40 a.m., I came to the dining room of the consulate. Papaya, toast, and eggs were on the breakfast table. Then suddenly, I heard a noise from the direction of Pearl Harbor. I thought it was thunder. I felt it in my stomach. Then I heard it again. Explosions, strong explosions. I ran out of the room. I went outside into the courtyard. I looked at the sky. I saw many, many airplanes flying through the clouds and smoke. And on the wings, I could see clearly the sun, the rising sun. I rushed into the house of the Consul General, and he was there. And he was listening to the shortwave radio. Too much noise outside. I couldn't hear anything. But I remembered the wind messages. Every morning at 8, we listen to the news on Radio Tokyo. If the announcer says twice, east wind rain, then it is war against the United States. West wind clear, then war against Britain, the Singapore attack. North wind cloudy, then war against Russia. This must be east wind rain, east wind rain. The Consul General, he only say, oh, this is war. Then the Consul General and I rush out in the courtyard again and look at the sky. We see airplanes flying through the smoke. We see dive bombing. We see high altitude bombing. Now it is war, war. And the Consul General and I, we hold hands. We hold hands tight. Buddy Morimura, he says, this is war, war. I have tears on my face. We gaze at the skies over Pearl Harbor, and that was the last day.
The smoke still billowed at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese launched a second phase of their war. They began an attack aimed at the British island outpost of Singapore. The Japanese struck at this supposedly unassailable fortress in a bicycle blitzkrieg through the back door, through the tin and rubber house of Malaya. Winston Churchill later called this battle the worst disaster in British history. When it was over, the British had lost to the Japanese the Gibraltar of the Far East, the bastion of empire, Singapore. Let's go back there now to the days just before the war.
Singapore in 1941, a sweltering 1 degree above the equator island, far emotionally and geographically from Britain's tight little island and Europe's war. 3/4 of its 750,000 are Chinese, less than 1 privileged percent white. British since Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles established it in 1819. Its complacent subjects are resentful of their 10% income tax, intolerant of change. But change will shatter this life of stingas and gin slings, cricket and racing clubs that is lethargic colonial Singapore. Guarding it, the $400 million naval base on the far northeast shore. 15 years building, all but a few of its giant guns point inflexibly at the sea. Behind it, the hot, humid, monsoon-drenched Malayan jungle, impenetrable, the British say. They have forgotten their own history. 1917, Lawrence of Arabia taking the Red Sea port of Aqaba from the landward side because the Turkish cannon fired only toward the sea. The defenders of Singapore, British Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, Far Eastern Commander. His Highness Sir Ibrahim, the Sultan of Johor. Lieutenant General A.E. Percival, British Commander, Malaya. Major General H. Gordon Bennett, commanding the Australians. A mixed force, all but the Sultan defending foreign soil. It is November 1941. The Japanese evacuate their citizens from Singapore. The danger in Asia is explosive and acute. With the fall of France, the Japanese have moved into Indochina, threatening Malaya and the riches of the Indies. But Fortress Singapore is confident and untroubled. On December 1st, the volunteers are mobilized. The Malaya Command garrison brought to second-degree readiness. Recruiting stepped up. But no guns go to Singapore's 425,000 Chinese, whose loyalty is not entirely trusted. December 8th, 1941, 2:30 a.m., 1/2 hour after Pearl Harbor. Undeclared war and the battle for Singapore begins 500 miles to the north in neighboring Thailand. Japanese landings are unopposed. A plan to outfit some troops in Thai uniforms is abandoned as unnecessary. So serene is the operation, a Japanese consul will greet invaders near one beachhead. Commanding the Japanese is Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Before the campaign is over, he will be known as the Tiger of Malaya. He lands his force at 3 points, Singura and Patani in Thailand, and Kota Baru in Malaya. British plans to counter a northern invasion with quick strikes into Thailand are never executed. Singapore only hears of the landing 6 hours later. Before that, at 4 a.m., Yamashita's planes have told the city war has come. "63 are dead, 133 injured, not a single Japanese plane down. But Singapore is unworried. Brooke Popham's order of the day, we are ready, we are confident, our defenses are strong and our weapons efficient." Across the border into Malaya sweep the Japanese. They capture the important railroad leading from Kota Baru. On good British roads, they whiz along on cheap, lightweight bicycles, carried on their shoulders in the jungles, left in the rear during battle. It is an army on wheels, and it moves. In spite of all the news reports at the time, few of these Japanese have ever seen a jungle before. They will be outnumbered, 138,000 British Imperials to 60,000 Japanese. But they have great advantages. Tanks. The British do not have a single tank in all Malaya. Planes. The Japanese have crushing air superiority and know how to use it. December 10th, 1941, the South China Sea, 100 miles off Malaya's east coast. Japanese air power scores a success almost as stunning as Pearl Harbor. Below, unprotected by fighter cover, the battleship Prince of Wales, the battle cruiser Repulse, 3 destroyers. 50 land-based high-level and torpedo bombers swarm in. 11:07 a.m. In 2 hours, 12 minutes, it is over. Prince of Wales and Repulse sunk, 840 men lost. In all the war, writes Churchill, I never received a more direct shock. In Malaya, the Japanese sweep on. Civilians begin a feverish evacuation. From Jitra, Alor Star, Kuala Kungsur, Ipoh, exotic place names now become gravestones in the Malayan tragedy. Destination for all, south to Singapore, the impregnable. Within a month, more than half of Malaya is Japanese. They surge to the gates of Kuala Lumpur, the colony's second city, 190 miles from Singapore. The defenders, British, Indian, and Australian, are undertrained, inexperienced. Some have fought bravely, but frustration and chaos are everywhere. At the front, the Japanese advance continues, down the hostile jungle, river, and mountain peninsula, unstopped by Malayan geography or imperial guns. Air power is paving the way for the Japanese. The British are down to obsolete Brewster buffaloes and 99-mile-an-hour wildebeests called flying coffins. General Sir Archibald Wavell, Supreme Commander Far East, leaves Singapore after an inspection tour. He is shocked to learn the island has no northern defenses, that the guns cannot be turned. His report will stagger Churchill. What is the use of having an island for a fortress, Churchill asks, if it is not to be made into a citadel? How is it that not one of you pointed this out to me? Kenneth Attawell was in Singapore at that time.
When we arrived in Singapore, I was with anti-aircraft. We arrived by the time the fighting was in Johor. And one look at Singapore Island and you thought, how on earth can this little happy, peaceful green island be a fortress? But the North Shore was completely undefended because nobody seriously anticipated attack from the north. And Mr. Churchill, as he then was absolutely astonished when General Wavell cabled and said the North Shore is undefended. You've got to remember that all the men who were fighting for the defense of Malaya and Singapore were on foreign soil. They were British, Australians, Indians, but when it came to a tight corner, they fought well together, those who still had the will to fight, those who were able to rise above this sense of defeat. But they would have fought better together, under better generalship, more inspired leadership.
The defenders now fall back in desperate retreat through the city of Johor Bahru and across the strait by causeway. Sappers mine the causeway. This heavy stone strip, almost 3/4 of a mile long, 70 feet wide, provides the only roadway between peninsula and island. At 8:15 a.m., January 31st, a 70-foot gap is blown in it. Now Singapore is truly an island. But one of the first things Yamashita will learn when he arrives in Johor is that the water in this gap is not more than 4 feet deep at low tide.
The siege of Singapore was underway. The date was February the 1st, 1942. It had taken the Japanese less than 8 weeks to reach the British bastion by way of its Achilles heel, the overland approach.
They have lost only 1,800 men, with 2,700 wounded. They have suffered practically no malaria. From the Sultan's palace in Johor, they can see the British fortress. They drink a toast in wine. It is a good place to die. Certainly we shall conquer. In beleaguered Singapore, Churchill's orders are equally explicit. I want to make it absolutely clear that I expect every inch of ground to be defended, every scrap of material or defenses to be blown to pieces, and no question of surrender to be entertained until after protracted fighting among the ruins of Singapore City. But fear drives thousands of civilians to the waterfront, where they abandon their cars and search for a ship and freedom. And in Singapore, the Raffles Hotel ballroom is still holding its daily tea dance, and the movies are open. The Philadelphia Story with Katharine Hepburn, and Reaching for the Sun with Joel McRae and Ellen Drew. Some of the evacuees will get away, most will not. Thousands of civilians are lost at sea. The Japanese control the skies. The convoys will come under merciless attack. As Japanese planes pound and pulverize, Yamashita plans his strategy in Johor. With him is intelligence officer Colonel Ichiji Sugita.
2月の8日と思いましたが、朝から
On February 8th in the morning, we were in the Sultan's palace in Johor Bahru. We were observing the enemy positions on Singapore Island. General Yamashita had conducted his operations very well over 60 days. He felt that the Japanese army had very good morale. He felt that the situation was right to envelop Singapore. In our strategy, we were seriously concerned that the British might spread oil on the waters between Singapore and Johor Bahru, and then set fire to the oil when we tried to cross. If they did that, we knew that crossing the Strait to Singapore would be very difficult. But General Yamashita was of very good heart.
Yamashita plans an invasion of the northwest coast, defended by Australians, instead of striking at the naval base as the British expect. The Japanese have 13,000 men in barges, pontoons, and collapsible boats. The Australians have only 2,500 men on these beaches. 10:30 p.m., February 8, 1942. In 1 hour, the Japanese have their foothold. By dawn, they will land an additional 10,000 men on Singapore Island. The battle for Singapore Island is joined. It will last just 7 days. February 14th, each side faces a crisis. Yamashita's force has practically run out of ammunition, but the defenders have a shortage far graver in the tropics: water. The Japanese have captured the reservoirs. Bombs and shell fire have broken the mains. Percival to Wavell, the situation is grim. The end comes at 5:15 p.m., February 15th, 1942. Colonel Sugita.
General Percival came to surrender with Major Cyril Wilde, his interpreter, and several other officers. I met them and brought them to the foot of Bukit Timah Hill, to the Ford factory there. I had told Major Wilde earlier that General Yamashita would talk with no one but Percival himself. Now Percival was here. I said to him, "We fought for 2 months. I compliment you on the British stand." In a few minutes, General Yamashita arrived. He did not believe that the British surrender would come so quickly. The meeting began with difficulty. Our interpreter was not very good. General Percival seemed to be dispirited. General Yamashita demanded he sign the unconditional surrender document immediately. General Percival asked if he would wait until the next morning. "In that case, we will continue our attack until the next morning," said General Yamashita very energetically. The British signed at 6:10, effective at 8:30. I had to take over the translating for our side, although my English is bad. Afterwards, we celebrated at headquarters. Dried cuttlefish, chestnuts, and wine, gifts of the Emperor.
At 8:30 on that Sunday of surrender, the Bishop of Singapore takes a service in St. Andrew's Cathedral, the Right Reverend John Leonard Wilson.
And I went into the cathedral. The cathedral had been used for a hospital for the last 5 or 6 days. I had made a condition that people of all races, that is, including the Japanese, should be allowed to come there and be treated. And the choir and the sanctuary were kept separate. I went in there and I took a service. It's true, we sang the hymn, Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven. And some asked me why. And I said, because it was a praise not merely that the hostilities had ceased, but because God was eternally Father-like. He tends and spares us, and we are still relying upon his fatherly care. So it was a very wonderful service.
In Singapore, the men, many of whom have fought with courage and valor under terrible handicaps, lay down their arms. British, Australians, Indians, local volunteers, more than 130,000 in all. The Japanese have lost only 9,824. In 70 days, 30 less than their timetable, the Japanese have taken Singapore, renamed it Shonan, Bright South. Why didn't you destroy the city, set fire to the oil, a Japanese asks a British officer. Oh, we'll be back, comes the reply. We may be defeated 99 times, but we always win the last battle. We'll be back. 3 days later, a Japanese memorial service. The men wearing packets with the ashes of their fallen, singing a march a sergeant has written for the occasion. The Japanese forced the vanquished to line the roads and listen. The last song they will hear for 3 cruel internment years, until 1945, when the Allies do come back to Singapore.
Besides Singapore, another early target for the Japanese was the Philippine Islands. Within hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese planes scored another great triumph with a knockout blow to Clark Field, the main U.S. air base in the Philippines. And with the first bombs came a devastating blow to the Filipinos' long-cherished hope for independence. The story of this attack and the eventual return of the Americans, of promises made and kept, is the theme of our report, Freedom for the Philippines. We begin by going back to the decade of the 1930s.
In the 1930s, Manila, capital of the Philippines, 5,000 miles by air from Hawaii and another 2,400 from San Francisco, is this country's chief oriental outpost. When the United States first occupied the islands during the Spanish-American War, they harbored 7 million persons and were so remote from our consciousness that Finley Peter Dunn's Mr. Dooley remarked that most Americans didn't know whether the Philippines was a place or something to eat. By the 1930s, the population has more than doubled, and Americans are so aware of their far-flung ward's existence and its rich natural resources that they have invested over $200 million in the region. American influences are apparent throughout its everyday life. Filipinos, there is a single political goal, independence. In 1934, the American Congress, in a significant departure from big power colonialism in Asia, pledges independence for the Philippines by 1946. Some Filipinos favor waiting for self-government until their country is politically mature. Others want to go it alone immediately. Leader of the country's major party, the Nacionalista, is Manuel Quezon, elected first president when the Philippines achieved Commonwealth status in 1934. Quezon promptly asked the help of a retired soldier to whose father the Filipino president once surrendered his sword after an abortive insurrection. For Douglas MacArthur, who brings along a promising young staff officer, it is his 3rd trip to the islands. As a field marshal in the Philippine Army, MacArthur conceives a 10-year plan for the defense of the Philippines. He has relatively few men to work with. Their training is still far from complete in 1941, when MacArthur becomes commander of United States forces in the Far East. Much of his tiny Air Force, whether through surprise or carelessness, historians still cannot agree, is destroyed before it leaves the ground. On December 26th, to spare Manila, MacArthur proclaims it an open city. Manila is nonetheless uneasy, and with good cause, for the Japanese ignore the proclamation. Japanese ground forces have already landed, first on December 10th at the north of Luzon, Manila's island. Then at Legazpi, Mindanao, Lingayen Gulf, Palawan, the Visayas, and central Luzon. For undermanned American and Filipino defenders, there remains only the forlorn hope of falling back on two strongholds, Bataan and Corregidor. On March 12th, under orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur heads for Australia. Before leaving, he swears a memorable prophetic oath.
I shall return. Nothing is more certain than the ultimate reconquest and liberation from the enemy of those and adjacent lands. I repeat, I shall return.
Courage alone cannot sustain a combat soldier. On April 9th, Bataan falls and the infamous death march begins for 35,000 enfeebled American and Filipino captives. These Japanese pictures show only its start and not its ghastly consequences. With Bataan under heel, the Japanese concentrate on Corregidor. Every inch of this 5-square-mile island fortress is raked with bombs. The Japanese besiege Corregidor not only from the air, but also with artillery from Cavite and Bataan. Huddled like moles in the Malinta Tunnel are soldiers, some of them wounded. Filipino government officials, doctors, and ill-equipped nurses, all awaiting the inevitable. On May 6, 1942, the Japanese finally set foot on Corregidor, and that proud fortress falls. To the Japanese General Homa, the American defeat is a glorious occasion. To the Filipinos, surrender means that independence must now wait for liberation. To MacArthur's ailing successor, General Jonathan Wainwright, it is a bitter moment, but he has capitulated, in his words, with broken heart and head bowed in sadness, but not in shame. Manila under the Japanese. Annoying a soldier of the occupation is punishable by death. Many Filipinos take to the outlying hills as guerrillas. To those who remain home, the Japanese quickly demonstrate their endorsement of the age-old adage that to the victor belongs the spoils. Some of the loot, especially sugar and coconut oil, is hard to dispose of. The other countries in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, of which the Philippine Islands is shortly to be dubbed a full-fledged member, aren't prosperous enough to buy it. No matter, the Japanese appropriate it anyway. Under the Japanese, the Filipinos eat frugally, but their conquerors dare not let them starve. Often the Japanese accompany their meager handouts with high praise for the virtues of austerity. Where once Americans figured importantly in the economy of the islands, Japanese move in. One step they take is to authorize the seizure of property belonging to enemy aliens. To simplify things, it is assumed that all property belongs to enemy aliens. Trying to smooth the course of their occupation, the Japanese institute what they call a policy of attraction. Their skilled propagandists work hard to put their best face forward, aided by their control of all channels of communication. Like many in occupying power, the Japanese appreciate the value of indoctrinating their subjects while they're young. Filipinos of all ages are told they have achieved independence, but it is a sham independence made in Japan. Quezon has fled to Washington. Puppet leaders friendly to Tokyo take over the island government. Most Filipinos hold them in contempt, but not openly. After all, they control the distribution of rice. There are the usual slogans and along with them the usual parades. Native collaborators and Axis nationals make a show of solidarity. Not every nationality is represented in the parades. In 8 internment camps throughout the islands, thousands of Allied prisoners, mostly American, British, and Dutch, struggle to stay alive. Their food, they never see meat, arrives in the same garbage cans used to haul away the Japanese trash. The difference in quality is slight. To amuse themselves, the captives give their huts names like Frothy Bottom and Glamourville. There's little news from the outside world in Glamourville. Its residents hardly dare believe the rumors that seep through, that MacArthur from the Southwest Pacific and the Navy from the South and Central Pacific already have moved far along the road back to Manila. At a Honolulu conference in July 1944, a fateful choice is posed to President Roosevelt, MacArthur, and Admiral Chester Nimitz. Should the next objective, after the Solomons, after New Guinea, after the Gilbert Islands, be Formosa or the Philippines? The decision is made. MacArthur's pledge will be fulfilled. The next strike will be at the Philippines. First target, Leyte, then once that beachhead is secured, to hit Lingayen Gulf and Mindoro. The ultimate objectives, Manila, Bataan, Corregidor. October 20th, 1944. After MacArthur's own dramatic return at Leyte, 8 months of fighting lie ahead. But now the story is different. In Leyte Gulf, Admiral William Halsey's ships have crippled the Japanese fleet. And American air power, humbled 3 years earlier, comes roaring back into its own. Near some of the beaches, the welcome is effusive and deceptively carefree. But the American casualty figures of the Leyte campaign alone, 3,500 killed, 12,000 wounded, attest to the fierceness of the fighting in the jungles beyond the shore. In Luzon, as on Leyte earlier, the avenging soldiers can pause only briefly to accept the homage of the Filipinos they free. For beyond this village is another, and beyond, a multitude of villages, all pointing toward victory. January 30th, 1945. 25 miles behind the Japanese lines, American Rangers liberate more than 500 survivors of the Death March and Corregidor. The next goal is Manila. Japanese suicide squads hold the city. The streets are mined. The people flee as best they can. The battle for Manila lasts a month. When it is over, much of the wounded city has been put to the torch. Before the flames have dwindled, the people of Manila start returning to their broken homes. Bataan reverts to Allied hands. And at Corregidor on March 2nd, 1945, nearly 3 years after his hasty evacuation, a solemn, triumphant MacArthur keeps his promise to return.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
On July 4th, 1946, America keeps its promise. In a formal proclamation, President Truman recognizes the independence of the Philippines as a separate and self-governing nation.